People with sensory processing challenges needs to toughen up.
That is not possible. You can't just change the way you perceive the world.
Children who face difficulties to process sensations are just ill-mannered and needs to be disciplined.
Children are not ill-mannered. They just perceive the world differently.
The brains of hypersensitive people are different.
Some research by Schuler-Green saying that a person who is autistic and hypersensitive perceives stimuli, sounds and touch slightly different.
All children or adults with autism spectrum disorder have sensory sensitivity issues.
You don't have to have sensory reactivity differences to be diagnosed with autism.
All sensory activities are beneficial for every kid on the spectrum in the same way.
It really depends on the person. Some children enjoy looking at patterns, for others it can be overwhelming.
Sensory challenges can only happen with the 5 basic senses that we are aware of.
No, it can also happen for proprioception and vestibular.
Thank you, Dr. Teresa. Hello everyone, I'm Ipshita De. I'm the research coordinator at India Autism Center, and today we will be talking with Dr. Teresa Tavasoli, and we will talk about sensory sensitivities in autism, and we welcome you all to India Autism Center podcast.
Hello everyone, my name is Teresa Tavasoli and I'm an associate professor at the University of Reading in England. And my main area of focus on research is sensory reactivity differences in autism, and I will be talking about that today.
So welcome Dr. Teresa to India Autism Center podcast. We are very glad to host you in India as well as at IAC. So without further ado, I would like to dive into your most interesting and expertise in the area of sensory sensitivities in autism. But before we go into the technicalities of the topic, I would love to know what interested you in this space in the first place. So you have dedicated your whole life to understanding the sensory needs throughout the spectrum of neurodevelopmental condition that we have. Could you please brief us on what interested you in this space?
What inspired me, yes.
Inspired me, yeah.
Yeah, also firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. What inspired me to become interested in sensory activity in autism was actually doing my undergraduate degree. So I am from Germany and I did my undergraduate degree in Germany, and during that time I worked in the psychiatry. And I met a young autistic woman. She came to the ward and she spoke few to no words as well to communicate. But I noticed that she seems to perceive the world very differently from the way I perceive the world around me. So firstly, she was very anxious when I would enter the room, but she also couldn't tolerate any clothing. She couldn't tolerate any water on her skin. So I started to think about that we all perceive the world differently and we all have our sensory preferences. But for her, especially being kind of overwhelmed by clothes, by water, really had an impact on her life. And at that stage, sensory reactivity was not part of the diagnostic criteria for autism yet. But as we'll hear throughout the podcast, it's very common in autistic individuals and others as well. And as said, we all vary in it. But I just started to think about how we all differ in sensory perception and also the effects this can have on daily life.
Right. So today in the podcast we will be talking about how the sensory processes are different in an autistic person and as a neurotypical person, and how, as you said, it affects their daily life and the perception of the world at large. But before we dive into that, I want to be clear for myself as well as our listeners about the terminologies that we use in this topic. So generally I would like to understand from you the term, like we use sensory sensitivity as well as sensory reactivity used a lot, like very synonymously. Is this the right way to approach this, or would you?
It is used interchangeably a lot, and there are different terms for the same difference.
Okay.
In the diagnostic manual, we have, for autism, we have hyperreactivity, which also refers to oversensitivity. or over responsivity in the literature sometimes, depending on the researcher and their favorite term.
Sure.
But basically, hyperreactivity, over responsivity, would describe someone who has a very strong reaction to the environment. It might be bright lights, it could be loud sounds, they are overwhelming. Someone might avoid these sensations.
Right.
Then we have hyporeactivity, which is also called under-responsivity or under-sensitivity. And that would describe someone who's reacting less to the environment. Maybe someone who doesn't notice pain as much as you would usually notice pain. Or someone who might not notice if it's hot or cold as much. And then we have sensory seeking, which others call sensory craving. So this is a real interest in the sensory environment around us. It could be looking at washing machines and enjoying looking at spinning objects, for example. And we've just last year, together with Nicholas Putz from King's College and Jason He, we came up with a taxonomy of sensory activity. And we are describing that it really depends on the level of analysis. So it depends on what are you interested in. Are you interested in sensitivity, in kind of perceptual sensitivity? How well can someone discriminate soft versus rough?
Right.
How well can someone hear tones?
Only the awareness aspect of it.
The sensitivity, so the detection threshold. So how well is someone perceiving the environment? How loud does music need to be until you're like, oh, I hear the music?
Right.
So that would be kind of more sensitivity. Or we can have effective reactivity. So that would be describing someone how is someone reacting to the sensory stimulus? Is it how is someone appraising the stimulus? So there's a loud sound and you don't like it. Or you like your sensory preferences. And then we also have behavioral responsivity. How is someone responding to it? So there's a loud sound and you might put your hands over your ears. So these are different levels that we're looking at. And in the literature, you find papers that are looking at detection thresholds, so sensitivity or reactivity or responsivity. But all of these kind of capture hyperreactivity, hypo, and seeking on different levels, if that makes sense.
Right. So the reactivity aspect of it is the emotional reaction to it that comes very automatically, like when we perceive, like we come across any stimulus.
Yes.
So would that be a mix between the physiology aspect, like how sensitive I am, and that is affecting how strongly I'm reacting to something? So that might be different in an autistic person and a non-autistic person.
So psychophysiology, what you just mentioned,
Right.
is actually a different level
Right.
altogether. Right. So that is your automatic bodily responses. There's a loud sound and you have a higher heart rate, or you start sweating more, so you have higher skin conductance. So that is a different level, and we don't 100% know how. It's not a direct relationship. So someone, for example, could be very sensitive. So perceptual sensitivity could be very low. You need a tiny sound until you hear something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your physiological response is also heightened. So there are different combinations of these. Also, Winnie Dunn, actually, she's an occupational therapist. She has another sensory model. And then there's Lucy Miller's taxonomy as well. But Winnie Dunn describes this combination. So she is saying that our neurological threshold, so our perceptual sensitivity, can be either high or it can be low. So our brain needs very little stimulation to notice it, or it needs a lot of stimulation to notice it. And then she's also talking about kind of the responsivity. So do we act in accordance with it passively, or do we counteract it? So let's say your brain has, you notice things immediately, but then you are counteracting this. So your behavior is counteracting. You might be a sensation seeker. So your brain needs a lot of stimulation to notice something, but you're counteracting that, so you seek out sensations in the environment, according to Winnie Dunn's model. Or you might be someone you need very little information to notice something, but you are active about this, so you're a sensory avoider.
Right.
So you're avoiding sensation. So we can fall into these different categories as well. And so she's trying to understand this complexity between this link between our kind of perceptual sensitivity, or she's calling it a threshold, and our behaviors towards it.
Right. So, from this discussion already it is becoming much more clearer that how individual difference can be so nuanced that
Yes.
someone can be perceiving the same sound is happening, in our surrounding, but someone can be, seeking it, and someone can be, wants to completely avoid it, or
Yes.
right.
And that is actually the complexity of sensory activity differences. Is one paper my previous PhD student Karen McLennan wrote about as well. We notice how complex sensory experiences are for autistic individuals, and it's not even as simple as for one person a loud sound, or let's say for one person touch always means I'm overwhelmed by it. So let's take Temple Grandin, who is an autistic professor in the US. She wrote the book Thinking in Pictures.
Right.
She's saying a light tap on the shoulder is overwhelming, but then she built a squeeze machine to hug her really tight.
Oh.
And you wouldn't necessarily expect someone, a tap on the shoulder is overwhelming, but then a squeeze is calming. But she's saying that the level of control, the amount of certainty,
Right.
also plays a role.
Right.
So it depends a little bit on the context as well. And is it self-generated, or is it generated by other people as well?
Right, and how much predictable that is, and if it is
Yes.
out of nowhere, a sudden sound that can be
Exactly.
extremely
Yeah.
jarring for
Yes.
an autistic person, right? Right. So yeah. So far in the podcast, you have shared so much about your research and current work in sensory sensitivity related to autism. But so, what are your? I would also like to know what you currently working on, and what is your current area of interest in
Yeah.
this space.
So my current area of interest is really related to the impact sensory reactivity differences can have for autistic individuals particularly. So one line of my research, which was funded by MQ and Autistica, an autism charity in the UK, was about the link between sensory activity differences and mental health. So I looked at the link between sensory hyperreactivity and anxiety, and I also looked at depressive symptoms as well. Because there are a lot of anecdotal reports that individuals say that hyperreactivity in particular is linked to anxiety. There are theoretical models by Shula Green, who is based at UCLA as well. So that's one line of my research. The other line of my research is thinking about sensory reactivity in a classroom. So I go to special needs schools and we measure classroom environment. So we measure temperature in the room, pollution level, noise level, light level, and we look at the behaviors that children are experiencing. Are they able to sit in their chair and attend to the teacher, or would they be maybe walking around the room as well, or doing stimming behavior? So we look at the behaviors, we look at their sensory preferences and the environment, which is a little bit in line with this idea about the medical model versus the social model. So the social model, thinking about how can we change the environment to make it more sensory friendly as well.
So yeah, definitely, like sleep and even food sensitivities, and the core symptoms of autism that we see, like difficulties in social communication, the repetitive behavior in particular,
Yes.
the stimming behavior that we see, has so much to do with the sensory needs of the child, either for seeking or as a reaction to intolerance of it, the hyperactivity aspect of it. So, but we generally don't see these core so-called the signs and symptoms of autism through this lens. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out. But could you also tell us, like, we discussed before the sensory reactivity aspect and how it affects day-to-day life. Could you please tell us how exactly does this look like for the experiential aspect of it? How does it look like for a person with autism who is having this kind of difficulties, who may or may not be able to tell other people that I'm having this problem? So what does that experience look like? What do they go through?
So just before I start, I think one thing to point out is that everyone is different. And like Lorna Rings said as well, you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. So I feel humbled to talk about sensory experiences, that I have my own sensory experiences, but I can tell you about what I've seen through research and through working with autistic individuals and what autistic individuals told me. So we have hyperreactivity, hypo and seeking. Hyperreactivity day to day could mean anything from when you wake up in the morning and how your bed sheets are feeling. Are they too rough for you? Then you need to put on clothes. What do you need to wash the clothes a lot of times because they are just, the feel of it, the feel of the fabric is just too much. You might go out and then you come across someone with a strong perfume. So you could also, it could affect your sense of smell as well. It could then also mean you go to a park and you might be worried because there's a dog and the dog might be barking. So really hyperreactivity can mean being overly sensitive to any stimuli in the environment. Or you might work in an office, and if you're autistic but you see hyperreactivity in other conditions as well, you might be overwhelmed by overhead lights and it might give you a headache. And one autistic woman once told me that if she has to sit in a room with an overhead light for the day, it will give her a headache for a whole week.
Oh my God.
Yes, so I don't like flickering lights either, but I will not have a headache for a week. So it affects people in different ways and can really affect them later on as well. Or I talked to an autistic student at the university, and she said the echo in the room when you give a lecture or the typing of everyone in the room gives her nausea, and she had to be physically sick as well because of that. So it can make your learning experience a lot more challenging. Then we have hyporeactivity, which can be anything from maybe not being aware of your body sensations and not knowing when you're hot or cold. And one autistic adult told us her partner needs to tell her, you're shivering, you're cold, you need to put on more clothes. Or as mentioned, pain sensitivity. So an autistic adult told us, I had no shoes and I had a blister and I walked around the whole day, and only in the evening when I took off my shoes I noticed that I had a blister. So that would be hyposensitivity, and that can affect you, your pain sensitivity, body awareness, or name being called, maybe not noticing that as much either. Or a car's passing in the street, you might not notice that the car's coming as well. And then we have sensory seeking, which is really a craving and a fascination with the environment around you. And that is a symptom in the diagnostic manual, but often autistic individuals tell us that it's beneficial. And it's something you should never try to take away from anyone. So for example, some kids might like flickering their fingers in the periphery of their vision and really like to see things in the periphery of their vision, or bringing things very close to you as well. Or it could be liking to feel textures for a long period of time. And that can be really calming as well, so that it's often used as a coping strategy as well. And again, everyone has their own sensory preferences. Someone might like touch, or someone might like being a seeker for auditory, so for hearing. So someone might like to listen to the music on repeat or to parts of a song for hours sometimes, and that can be perceived as quite pleasurable as well. There are of course some sensory seeking behaviors which can lead to becoming disorganized if it's too much over time as well, but often they're reported to be calming and beneficial.
Right. The pain that we feel while we are hurt, we think like, I'm just thinking from my perspective, like sometimes we think that it's so it hurts so much, and the kind of displeasure that we feel while we are hungry, we get to know that we are hungry and we should go and eat, and while we are sleepy, we these are like necessary survival mechanisms that are inbuilt or that is necessary for preserving this body and mind. And it's so while you were describing, I was thinking, I was trying to picturize how the life, starting from waking up in the morning, and how the day looks like. So many challenges the person might go through, through due to this difficulties, and and on top of that, when other people, us so-called neurotypicals, we don't understand why they are doing something the way they are doing, and makes their life all the more difficult in that way. Right. So you also mentioned that it's sensory sensitivity is not only common in autism, but also in other conditions as well. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes. So sensory activity, as mentioned, differs for everyone in some ways. And we have, in autism, we have about up to 95% of autistic individuals will experience some form of a sensory reactivity difference. In one study where we ask autistic adults to tell us if they're hyper or seeking, we had 94% of the autistic adults telling us they're hyper reactive. 94%.
Wow.
We had about 30% telling us they're hyporeactive, and 40% telling us they're seeking out sensations.
Wow.
But we also had 25% of that sample had all three. So it's really complex. And this was just one example. An individual can, of course, vary. But we also see sensory activity differences, in particularly hyperreactivity and ADHD as well, so an attention hyperactivity deficit disorder as well. So 50% of children and adults with ADHD also have sensory reactivity differences, which is not quite as high, but still quite common. We see it in OCD as well. And even Ben Sasson, a researcher in Israel, conducted a study in general kindergartens, and she found that 5 to 16% of everyone in that population had sensory reactivity differences. So in some ways, you're mentioning it's so hard to experience that or to imagine it, but if we think about neurodiversity as well, rather than neurodivergence as well, that if up to 16% of the general population experience sensory reactivity symptoms, you might be able to a certain degree to imagine. But then, as mentioned, it is much more common in autism, up to 95% of the population.
I think I belong to that 16% because I do have a lot of, I do have, even in India, we have visited India from UK and Europe, and so you must be knowing that we have a lot of hustle and bustle going on in the city and in the country, but sometimes it do feel sometimes overwhelming, the traffic and the lights and the sound, too much information throughout. So I'm not saying I'm anyway neurodivergent, but maybe I second your idea that we do have differential levels of sensory sensitivities even in general population. So it is not it's not a very distant concept that it is very it's present only in autistic people. But that also brings. I would also like to know from you that. So what is the difference between sensory preference and when do we call it the person has a sensory sensitivity issue? Like I said, I have some difficulties, but I can say safely that I will not. As you mentioned that someone has a headache for a week, it may not affect me in that level, but maybe momentarily. So what is exactly the difference between these two?
If it has an impact on your daily life. So sensory preference could be your favorite color is yellow, or you could not like the color yellow. But then one example I have of an autistic child who went to school and every Tuesday would have more kind of they're sometimes called challenging behaviors, which is not a very nice term, but would find it more difficult in class to concentrate. And then they found out it was because the teacher was always wearing a yellow jumper on Tuesdays. So it impacted the child's learning. So you can like a color, you can have a preference, but when it starts impacting you, then you might say it's a difference or it becomes a challenge as well.
that impedes my daily work, that
Yes.
impedes my relationship with other people, or I choose not to
Yeah.
go somewhere, so that's when I should be careful.
Yes, and we would measure, occupational therapists would measure sensory activity differences as well, and then it depends on the degree you have it, how much of it do you have it. Is it just you just don't like the color yellow and that is overwhelming, or is it also that you cannot tolerate any clothes and you cannot tolerate sounds? So the amount of it as well. So we would have tests, sensory questionnaires for parents, like the sensory profile or sensory observations, where you can measure the amount of sensory reactivity differences. And what you do then is you take let's say 1,000 children, and you see this is the average.
Right.
This is how many sensory differences the average person has.
Yeah.
And then you can say, ooh, this is quite away from the mean.
Right.
And then you would say this person has more sensory reactivity differences.
Right.
But they're different questionnaires, and they identify sensory reactivity differences slightly different depending on the measure used as well.
Right. So you have also developed the SAND test.
Yes.
So that measures sensory sensitivity to in young children, like 2 to 12 years of age. So similarly, there are other tests for
Yeah.
adults, as well as the parent report, as you said. Yeah. So definitely before like diagnosing ourselves with any kind of having, oh, I also have sensitivity issues, let's not do that, because it's not a it's a serious experience for people who actually have it. So we should definitely visit a professional and understand it
Yes.
from them, what exactly issues you have and how can you can be helped with. Right. So so this brings to a very important clarification that I need to have for myself, as well as for our listeners, that there are many misconceptions surrounding this this idea of sensory sensitivity, because as I said, that it can be mistook as sensory preference, something that I like or dislike, rather than something that a characteristic or a feature that I have that can be very debilitating for my daily life and my existence, so to say. So it's not like we can just get over it or get used to some things like bright lights, or get used to it because it's like that. But so what would you say? What are the other misconceptions that we should be careful about while we are thinking and talking about this sensory sensitivity aspect?
I think again, so one autistic adult once told me, he said, believe us. So we should believe if someone, and again, you talk to an autistic individual and everyone is different, but believe what they're telling you. And he mentioned in particular in the healthcare system as well, if he talks to a doctor, believe that this is the experience that he has. As well. So I had one autistic woman who said she can hear the electricity running in the walls. And but the medical doctor she was talking to said you can't. We are not able to do that. So in some ways, to believe whatever experience someone is having, to believe that.
Right.
I think another misconception is potentially that it's always challenging as well, which I mentioned before. So there are some aspects of sensory activity differences, such as seeking, that can be quite comfortable and beneficial as well. So, which is also, if you always say it's an issue, it's a challenge, so there are some aspects of sensory activity which can be comforting as well.
So from what you said, I understand that the first step is to develop awareness of what sensory sensitivities are and how can what it can feel like. And I would suggest that we take experience from our own daily life where we feel disturbed by something and extrapolate that data and try to understand. I know it's I mean, it's not possible to exactly empathize, but at least we can imagine and sympathize with what this experience can be.
Yeah.
when it is extrapolated in that capacity, and how incapacitating that can be. So that's the first step, is I think would be awareness, and
Yes.
definitely, as you said, to believe them. No one will, I mean, there is no point in, saying lies about this, that, I feel certain way. So if someone is feeling discomfort,
Yeah.
the least we can do is to feel, is to
Yes.
give them that space and be empathetic about it. So yeah, I completely
Yeah.
agree.
And maybe do a podcast with someone who is autistic and ask about
Right.
their sensory experiences as well. To get
Absolutely.
a better, or maybe two people, because everyone experiences the world so
Differently.
differently.
Right.
Yeah.
So the next section of the podcast I would, dedicate to bridging the gap between research and practice. So whatever finding you are finding in the research setting, in the lab setting, so how can we translate that into practice? And you mentioned that a lot has to do with how the environment is, the social model
Yeah.
aspect of it, and how the temperature, the lighting, everything has such a great impact on our senses. So I would like to know from you, and I'm aware that it's an area that you love talking about. It's your interest, the architecture and the design aspect of it, designing spaces that are
Yeah.
more inclusive, autism friendly, sensory. It
Yeah.
Yeah, sensory friendly, and so we also have, as you are aware, that India Autism Center is a residential space, and we are trying to build a township project around for autistic people and family to live happily, and for us to do that, and other people, the daycare centers, universities who are trying to build autism friendly spaces. Would you help us to understand what should we keep in mind to while designing these spaces?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, yes, as you said, a topic I've been interested in for a while. And during my PhD, which is also a few years ago, I was approached by Andy Brand, who worked for the Helen Hamlin Centre of Design at the Royal College of Art in London.
Right.
And he was designing guidance on housing for autistic adults. And it is called Living in the Community, Housing for Autistic Adults. It's a freely available booklet as well that you can get online. And they interviewed autistic adults as well. They worked with carers of autistic adults. So we had parents, we had teachers in the room, researchers as well. And we came up with these guidance on sensory friendly spaces. So we thought about safety issues, we thought about triggers in the environment, we thought about the light, the acoustics of a room as well. The kitchen appliances that you are getting, do they hum, or is it a quiet kitchen appliances?
Okay.
That is one guidance that is out there. And then a front runner in this type of research and architecture for autism is Magda Mostafa, who has a website and many booklets and books about design for autism. And then there is the British Standard Institute, the BSI, who has developed guidance for neurodivergence and design. And if you read these different guidance, as well as one from the NHS, the healthcare system in the UK, that one is called It's Not Rocket Science, and you can get that freely as well online, where they come up with the 10 most sensory friendly principles. So a lot of these guidance have similar tips, and I'm just going to mention a few of them. So one is predictability. Make spaces more predictable. If and this I think works for autistic and non-autistic children or adults. If someone has to come to a new place, on your websites have pictures of the place available, maybe even a little video walking through the rooms. That is what the entrance looks like. This is what the reception area will look like. So someone has seen it in advance and knows how to, is able to predict it more.
Yeah.
Then we also think about the lights that you have. So are you using overhead fluorescent lights, which is often described as being overwhelming as well? What are the textures of the chairs that you are having? Maybe have a chair that is soft and have a chair that is hard. So have the flexibility and give individuals control over the environment as well. Think about the smells that someone is experiencing. So cleaning products were mentioned in this sensory guide as well. Maybe also especially if you have the chance to have larger spaces, offer someone the opportunity to have a quiet room,
Right.
or a quiet space where someone can retract if things get too overwhelming as well.
So earlier you were mentioning, offline while we were talking, you were mentioning about the project Soothe.
Oh, yes.
Would you like to mention that for our listeners?
Yes, of course. So Project Soothe was started by Stella Chan from the University of Edinburgh,
Right.
and she is now with us at the University of Reading. And she started this community science project where she asked individuals from the community to send pictures. And over thousands of pictures were sent about what is calming for you, what is soothing. And what she found was that individuals, these were non-autistic, possibly also autistic, and just the general population, pictures of nature, of water features, of animals, a lot of sleeping cats for some reason, were perceived to be soothing by the public. And then when she came to Reading, we replicated this in autistic individuals, and we asked the community, send us pictures of soothing images, and it's exactly the same.
Wow.
So the categories are the same. It is water features, nature, as well as animals as well. Autistic individuals also liked patterns as well, which we didn't see as much in the non-autistic group, but overall we all like to look at nature, water features. And one autistic adult even said to me, why do you need to do research to know that nature is soothing? But yeah, so, and we also found that looking at even 25 soothing images can help your mood as well. So that might be, I'm swapping topics here, but you can have like a little sensory toolbox with soothing images for someone as well. So there are applications of Project Soothe as well for real life.
So at IAC, we are definitely keeping this nature aspect as well as animals, on the campus. So we will have an animal farm.
Amazing.
Yeah, so petting zoo as we are calling it. And there we will have pony and dogs and cows and horses, the smaller animals, the rabbits, the guinea pigs, and and the whole family of them. We already have it like while we talk. So and the entire campus will be completely wrapped in trees and water bodies and connected by canals. So it's definitely, we are aiming for that. And the lighting aspect that you mentioned, we are very careful of those as you mentioned, the
Yes.
overhead lights and
Yes.
all of that, no glares, and we
Yeah.
are definitely keeping these aspects
Yeah.
in mind. But the resources that you mentioned, I think we would definitely make use of it, and our listeners can also take help from
Yes.
it. We should definitely keep these aspects in mind that has been outlined through research. So now I'll come back to your experience working in the field like for so long, and talking to different stakeholders like different researchers, autistic people themselves, their families, professionals. So how would you say that your understanding of autism has changed or have evolved over time, doing what you do, like the lens through which you see autism?
So one thing which I still think right from the start, and I still feel that sensory activity is really important to look at in
Right.
autism, but I think it evolved over the years as well. One aspect is really the push for participatory science. What I mean by that is that to involve the autistic community in every step of your research. I have a lot of autistic students working with me, or other autistic researchers. So I work with families and I ask, what research should we be doing in the area of sensory reactivity? over to how we can design our experiments, how we run them. Is this comfortable? Is this information sheet, does that make sense to you? To how should we interpret our results? And to give you one example, a colleague of mine has done a research on visual illusions. And our brain usually tricks us. So when we see dots moving and they're attached to a person, we think someone is moving.
Yeah.
But autistic individuals in some studies didn't have the same amount
That
of visual
illusion.
illusions.
Wow.
And then they interpret it as a deficit in visual illusions. But you can also interpret it as seeing the world more how it really is.
Exactly.
So you can always, and I think that is, and again, these researchers now change as well how they would interpret it. They said if I would write the paper now, I would maybe ask the autistic community to interpret results with me. And that also, I don't want to read my older papers anymore because I'm not sure the way I spoke, the language I used, I think we become a lot more positive and less stigmatizing these days as well. So I think that is really important for the whole field of autism. And then the other thing I learned is that there is always more to learn. So the complexity of sensory reactivity issues. I started as a PhD student, but I kept going because there's always more to learn and the impacts it can have on daily life, on mental health as well. Yes.
So yeah, I definitely agree with we should have more of participatory research, and that will change our perspective as to how, as you said, the interpretation aspect of it as well, because we are very we sometimes tend to think in that medical model lens, and this is a deficit, this is there, this is not there, and that can be misleading sometimes. So completely agreed. And so in Western world it is very it is coming up, and it's quite more common to include participatory to conduct participatory research, while in low income setting or in India, we from IEC we conducted under the mentorship of Professor Bhishmadev Chakrabarti from University of Reading, we conducted the participatory research and understand the needs of the community in terms of skills, intervention needs, as well as research needs. So I'll just report one very interesting finding. So our project had a pan India survey, as well as a subset of the people were interviewed as well to get a more in-depth idea of their preferences. So under the intervention list, they had majority have voted mental health counseling as the second option.
Yes.
And then when we interviewed the parents and autistic people, so from the parents we got to know that it's not for them, for the autistic kids, but for themselves, and they wanted more support in that way from the community as well, from professionals as well, so that they can they need they want to know more about how well they can support their child. They need it for their mental health, and to manage their anxiety and the stress that it has to navigate through life, given that a majority section of the society, as a society, we are not as sensitized as we should be. So yeah, that was an interesting eye-opening finding for us. So yeah, we definitely have included these aspects in our planning, architecture, and as well as service development. Yeah, but long way to go. Right. Regarding parents, so they do, as I mentioned, that they do go through a lot of anxiety and uncertainty regarding as to how to help their child. So what would you suggest the parents, or what advice would you have for them as to better able to manage their child's anxiety as they are going through any kind of sensory issues? As you mentioned that they are very linked, how sensory sensitivity affects the mental health of a person as well. So what role can parents play to make their child's life more easier?
Yes, so I think if you notice that your child might either be anxious or they might have sensory reactivity differences, it's really important to talk to healthcare professionals. For sensory reactivity difference, occupational therapists would be there to help and to identify what the sensory reactivity difference is. For anxiety, it would be more a psychologist, a clinical psychologist who can understand the anxiety challenges more. But you also mentioned this link between sensory reactivity and anxiety, and we have done some work on that. And when we ask autistic adults, what do you think comes first? Are you first hyperreactive to the environment, or are you first anxious? What is driving what? And autistic adults told us that they felt sensory hyperreactivity precedes anxiety. So firstly, they are sensorily overwhelmed, and then they become anxious. But they also told us that anxiety predicts seeking behaviors, and that seeking behaviors comes after, so maybe used as a coping strategy. So for parents, maybe what you could do, but I'm not a clinician, I'm just a researcher, but for parents what you could do is to identify your child's triggers. Maybe take a diary, or like try to identify your child's preference, to see what is it that my child is overwhelmed by, what is it that my child does not notice as much, and what is it that my child is seeking out. And as mentioned before, you can have like these little sensory toolboxes or something that you can even take with you, where you have things like a particular smell your child might like, and when you see they're getting more and more agitated, and as a parent you know your child, you can maybe show them soothing pictures of nature, so you can try to identify what works for your child, what is soothing for them, and what is overwhelming for them.
So we have come to the fag end of the podcast, and I would like to understand from you, what do you see as the more important areas of work that are yet to be done and explored in research? What would you say that would be the upcoming or future areas that we should be looking into?
I think you did it exactly the right way here at the ISC. So you asked the autistic community, what should we look into? Personally, I think what would be really interested in the field of sensory activity is to focus both on challenges but as well as strength. So to identify more the strengths associated with sensory activity differences maybe as well. So you have a bit more balanced research in that area.
Right. So the seeking aspect of it, how it is helping them, and how we can be of help to them, so that they are able to cope better. And not just focus on they have these problems and where they are having issues. And definitely, as you mentioned, that we will take care of that architecturally, the environmental wise, and for parents as well, we should take note of what is happening, but definitely focus on how these differences can be a strength as well sometimes.
Or maybe if someone is very sensitive to the environment, does that mean, is that linked to attention to detail? And attention to detail can be very useful as well for different jobs as well. So you can find out someone's strength and maybe see,
and overcome the deficit mode of thinking, and then focus on the strength aspect of it as a whole. Completely agreed. Thank you, Dr. Teresa, for giving us such an informative, podcast. For me, I personally found it very informative and enriching.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening today.